The dim lighting of Murphy's pub cast long shadows across the worn wooden tables, creating an atmosphere that felt both welcoming and secretive. Sarah Mitchell sat alone at the far end of the bar, her fingers wrapped around a glass of whiskey that she hadn't touched in the past 20 minutes. The amber liquid caught the light from the overhead lamp, creating patterns that reminded her of the desert sunset she used to watch from the cockpit of her F/A-18 Super Hornet. It had been 3 years since she'd last flown a mission, 3 years since the incident that changed everything, and 3 years since she'd heard anyone call her by her call sign. The military retirement papers in her apartment drawer felt like a death certificate for the person she used to be. Captain Sarah Viper 1 Mitchell, one of the most decorated female fighter pilots in Navy history, had become just another civilian trying to blend into the background of everyday life. The bar was filled with the usual Friday night crowd, office workers unwinding after a long week, college students celebrating the end of exams, and a few older veterans who came here to share stories and find solace in the company of others who understood the weight of service. Sarah had chosen this place specifically because it was far enough from any military base that she wouldn't run into anyone from her past life. She was wrong. The man who walked through the door at 9:47 p.m. had the unmistakable bearing of special operations. His movements were controlled and purposeful, his eyes automatically scanning the room for exits and potential threats before he even approached the bar. Sarah recognized the type immediately. She'd worked with enough Navy SEALs during joint operations to spot one from across a crowded room. He was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair that was regulation short and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite. There was a small scar above his left eyebrow and another one running along his neck, barely visible above his collar. His civilian clothes, dark jeans and a simple black t-shirt, couldn't disguise the fact that he was military through and through. Sarah turned back to her drink, hoping he wouldn't notice her. She'd become an expert at making herself invisible in public spaces, a skill she'd never needed during her years as a pilot when she'd commanded attention and respect wherever she went. Now, anonymity was her shield against questions she didn't want to answer and conversations that led to explanations about why she was no longer flying. The SEAL ordered a beer and struck up a conversation with the bartender, his voice carrying the easy confidence that came from years of leadership in high-stress situations. Sarah couldn't help but listen as he talked about his recent deployment, careful to avoid any classified details but painting a picture of months spent in hostile territory with his team. "You know what I miss most," he said to the bartender, taking a long drink from his bottle. "Working with good pilots. There's nothing like having someone you trust completely watching your back from 30,000 feet. Sarah's hand tightened around her glass. She'd been that pilot once, the one teams requested by name, the one who could put ordnance on target within meters of friendly forces, the one who brought everyone home safely. The memories of those missions flooded back with unexpected intensity, bringing with them the familiar ache of loss that never quite went away. The SEAL must have noticed her reaction because he turned in her direction, his green eyes meeting hers across the dimly lit space. There was something in his gaze, recognition, perhaps, or maybe just curiosity about the woman sitting alone at the end of the bar who'd suddenly gone rigid at the mention of military pilots. "Sorry," he said, raising his voice slightly to address her directly. "Didn't mean to bring up work stuff. I'm Marcus, by the way. Marcus Chan." Sarah nodded politely but didn't offer her name. She'd learned that introductions led to questions, and questions led to explanations she wasn't ready to give. "It's fine," she said simply, hoping he'd take the hint and return to his conversation with the bartender. Marcus didn't take the hint. Instead, he picked up his beer and walked over to where she was sitting, settling onto the bar stool 2 seats away, close enough to continue the conversation but far enough to respect her personal space. It was a tactical decision, Sarah realized, the kind of spatial awareness that came from years of reading people and situations. "You look like you knew what I was talking about," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp with interest. "Military?" Sarah considered lying. She'd done it before when strangers asked too many questions. But something about Marcus made her pause. Maybe it was the way he'd approached her, confident but not aggressive, interested but not pushy. Or maybe it was the fact that she'd been sitting in this bar for 3 hours without talking to another human being, and the loneliness was starting to eat away at her carefully constructed walls. She said finally, the word carrying more weight than she'd intended. Marcus nodded as if he understood exactly what that simple word meant.
What branch? Navy. Rate? Sarah hesitated.
Her military occupation specialty was classified information in some contexts, but, in others, it was just another job description. I was a pilot, she said carefully. The interest in Marcus's eyes sharpened immediately.
No kidding? What did you fly? Hornets mostly. Some Super Hornets toward the end.
Marcus let out a low whistle of appreciation.
Carrier ops? That's serious business. How many deployments? 7.
The number came out automatically, along with the pride that she'd never been able to completely suppress. 7 deployments, each one lasting 6 to 8 months, each one filled with missions that pushed the boundaries of what was humanly possible. 7 deployments as a fighter pilot, Marcus repeated, shaking his head in obvious admiration.
That's incredibly impressive.
I've worked with a lot of pilots over the years, but most of them tap out after 3 or 4 carrier deployments.
The stress of those operations is intense.
Sarah found herself warming to the conversation despite her better judgment. It had been so long since someone had understood the magnitude of what carrier aviation demanded, the split-second decision-making, the physical and mental toll of repeated catapult launches and arrested landings, the constant pressure of knowing that one mistake could end not just your career but your life. The deployments weren't the hard part, she said, surprising herself by continuing the conversation. It was everything else, the politics, the bureaucracy, the constant fight to prove that you belonged up there.
Marcus nodded knowingly.
Gender barriers in special operations communities.
I get it.
We've got some incredible female operators now, but it wasn't always that way. Breaking those barriers takes a special kind of courage. It wasn't about courage, Sarah said, her voice carrying a hint of the steel that had once made junior officers straighten their spines when she walked into a ready room. It was about being twice as good to get half the recognition.
And you were? Twice as good? Sarah met his gaze directly for the first time since he'd sat down. I was the best.
It wasn't a boast, it was a statement of fact delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who had the record to back it up. Marcus seemed to recognize the difference because his expression shifted from casual interest to genuine respect. What was your call sign? He asked. The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd been waiting for it, dreading it, but also secretly hoping someone would ask. Call signs were more than just nicknames in military aviation, they were earned through actions, forged in the crucible of combat operations, and carried with a pilot throughout their entire career. They represented not just who you were, but what you'd accomplished and what you stood for.
Sarah's call sign had been legendary in naval aviation circles.
It had been earned during her 3rd deployment when she'd single-handedly taken out a surface-to-air missile site that had been threatening coalition aircraft for weeks. The attack had required flying through a valley so narrow that her wingtips had come within feet of the canyon walls, executing a bombing run that required precision measured in inches rather than feet. The enemy radar operators never saw her coming, and the missile site was destroyed with surgical precision that left surrounding civilian structures completely untouched. After that mission, her squadron commander had started calling her Viper, for the way she'd struck fast and deadly from an unexpected angle. The one had been added later, after she'd become the lead pilot for her squadron's most dangerous missions, the one who went in first and cleared the way for everyone else to follow. But saying her call sign out loud would open doors she'd spent 3 years trying to keep closed. It would lead to questions about why she'd left the Navy, about the incident that had ended her career, about the choices she'd made that had cost her everything she'd worked for. It would force her to confront the guilt and shame that she'd been running from since the day she turned in her wings. Sarah looked down at her untouched whiskey, watching the amber liquid catch the light. She could feel Marcus waiting for her answer, could sense his patience and his growing understanding that this was more than just casual conversation for her. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the words she couldn't bring herself to say. Finally, she looked up and met his eyes again. There was something in his expression that made her think he might understand, not just the pride that came with earning a call sign, but the pain that came with losing the right to use it. Viper 1, she said quietly.
Marcus went completely still.
His beer bottle, which he'd been raising to his lips, stopped halfway to his mouth. His green eyes widened with what looked like shock, and, for a moment, he just stared at her as if he'd seen a ghost. Then, his hand started to shake, and the bottle slipped from his fingers, hitting the bar with a sharp crack and sending beer spilling across the wooden surface and onto his jeans. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the bar.
Viper 1.
Sarah watched the beer drip off the edge of the bar onto the floor, her heart pounding as she realized that Marcus's reaction wasn't just surprise at learning her call sign.
It was recognition. Personal recognition.
"You know that call sign," she said.
It wasn't a question.
Marcus was still staring at her, his face pale beneath his tan. He seemed to be struggling to find words, opening his mouth and closing it again as if everything he wanted to say was getting stuck somewhere between his brain and his voice. The bartender appeared with a towel, efficiently cleaning up the spilled beer while shooting curious glances at both of them. Marcus barely seemed to notice, his attention completely focused on Sarah as if she were the only person in the room. "I know more than your call sign," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion.
"I know what you did."
Sarah felt her chest tighten with familiar panic. She'd moved across the country specifically to avoid having this conversation, to avoid the looks of recognition and the questions that inevitably followed. She'd given up everything, her career, her identity, her sense of purpose, to escape the weight of what she'd done and what it had cost. "I don't know what you think you know," she said carefully, but October 15, 2019, Marcus interrupted, his voice steady now but carrying an intensity that made Sarah's blood run cold.
Operation Desert Lightning. Northern Syria. The date hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach.
She'd tried for 3 years to forget that date, to bury it so deep in her memory that it couldn't hurt her anymore. But here it was, spoken aloud by a stranger in a bar 3,000 miles from where it had happened, and suddenly, she was right back there, strapped into the cockpit of her Super Hornet, flying through hostile airspace on a mission that should have been routine. "You were the angel on our shoulder that day," Marcus continued, his voice filled with an emotion that Sarah couldn't quite identify. "Strike Package Alpha, close air support for a SEAL extraction.
Call sign Guardian Angel."
Sarah's hands were shaking now, and she gripped the edge of the bar to steady herself. Guardian Angel, she remembered that mission designation, remembered the urgency in the air traffic controller's voice when the call for close air support had come through, remembered the way her heart had started racing when she'd realized that American forces were pinned down and taking heavy fire. "The extraction went bad," Marcus said, his eyes never leaving her face.
"Intel was wrong about enemy positions.
What was supposed to be a simple pickup turned into a full-scale ambush. We were trapped in a compound with no way out, taking fire from 3 directions, and our helicopter couldn't get close enough for extraction because of the anti-aircraft fire." Sarah closed her eyes, but that only made the memories more vivid. She could see it all again, the GPS coordinates appearing on her heads-up display, the desperate radio calls from the ground, the maze of buildings that made target identification almost impossible. She could feel the weight of the aircraft as she'd put it into a steep dive, the G-forces pressing her back into her ejection seat as she'd lined up for her attack run. "We were about to be overrun," Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper now.
"Rodriguez was hit, bleeding out fast.
Chen, no relation to me, different Chen, had taken shrapnel to his chest and was having trouble breathing. Williams was almost out of ammunition, and I was trying to coordinate with air traffic control while keeping enemy fighters at bay with what little ammo we had left." Sarah opened her eyes and found Marcus staring at her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see right through all the walls she'd built around that day. "Then, you came out of nowhere," he said. "Like an avenging angel, dropping out of the sky and putting bombs exactly where they needed to go. You cleared our escape route with surgical precision, close enough to the compound that we could feel the concussion waves, but far enough that none of us got hurt.
You gave us the window we needed to get to the extraction point."
"I remember," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible. "You saved 6 lives that day," Marcus said. 6 men who went home to their families because of your skill and your courage. Rodriguez got to see his daughter graduate from high school. Chen made it to his son's wedding last year. Williams started a foundation for wounded veterans.
Sarah felt tears threatening and fought them back.
She'd heard variations of this story before, the grateful testimonials, the commendations, the praise for her precision and professionalism under pressure. But she'd also heard the other story, the one that had ended her career and driven her into exile.
"You don't know the whole story," she said.
"I know enough," Marcus replied firmly. "I know that you risked your own life to save ours. I know that your actions that day were nothing short of heroic. And I know that every man on that team owes you a debt we can never repay." Sarah shook her head, the weight of guilt and shame pressing down on her like a physical force.
"You don't understand."
"There were others, there was a second compound," Marcus said, cutting her off.
"I know about that too."
Sarah's breath caught in her throat. If he knew about the second compound, then he knew everything. He knew about her choice, about the split-second decision that had haunted her every day for 3 years, about the reason she could no longer call herself Viper One with pride. "Then, you know why I'm not flying anymore," she said, her voice hollow. "I know why you think you shouldn't be flying anymore," Marcus corrected. "But I also know that you saved 6 American lives that day, and that matters more than anything else." Sarah stood up abruptly, throwing money on the bar and grabbing her jacket. She'd made a mistake coming here, a mistake talking to him, a mistake letting her guard down. The whole point of moving across the country had been to escape conversations exactly like this one. "I have to go," she said, heading for the door. "Sarah, wait," Marcus called after her, but she was already pushing through the crowd, desperate to get outside where she could breathe again. She made it halfway across the parking lot before she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Marcus following her, his expression determined but not aggressive. "Please," he said, stopping a few feet away.
"Just give me 5 minutes.
There are things you need to know about that day, things you never heard because of what happened afterward." Sarah stood frozen beside her car, her keys in her hand, torn between the desperate need to run and the equally desperate need to know what he meant. After 3 years of carrying the weight of that day alone, part of her wanted to hear what he had to say, even if it made everything worse. 5 minutes, she said finally. Marcus nodded gratefully and moved closer, but carefully, as if he understood that she was like a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "What you did that day didn't just save our lives," he said. "It changed the entire course of the war in that region. The compound you hit was more than just an enemy position, it was a command and control center for terrorist operations across 3 provinces. The intelligence we recovered from that site led to dozens of successful operations over the next 2 years." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. She'd never heard any of this before. After the incident, she'd been pulled from active duty so quickly that she'd never received a full briefing on the aftermath of the mission. "The Joint Chiefs wanted to give you the Distinguished Flying Cross," Marcus continued. "There was talk of a Silver Star. Your actions that day were being studied at the War College as an example of perfect close air support execution." Then, why Sarah started, but couldn't finish the question. "Because politics trumped performance," Marcus said, his voice bitter with frustration. "Because someone higher up the chain needed a scapegoat for the civilian casualties, and you were the most convenient target."
The civilian casualties.
The words hit Sarah like they always did, a physical blow that left her struggling to breathe. 18 non-combatants killed when her second bomb had hit what intelligence had identified as an enemy ammunition depot but what had actually been a school being used as a shelter by families fleeing the fighting. It had been the right target based on the intelligence she'd been given. Every analysis afterward had confirmed that she'd followed proper procedures, that the target had been legitimate according to the information available at the time, and that the tragic outcome had been the result of faulty intelligence rather than pilot error. But 18 people were still dead, including 7 children, and someone had to be held accountable. Sarah leaned against her car, the cool metal a stark contrast to the heat coursing through her body as Marcus's words echoed in her mind. The parking lot felt surreal under the orange glow of the streetlights, like a stage set for a conversation she'd been running from for 3 years. "You don't understand," Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly. "Those children. I was supposed to protect civilians, not kill them. That's the whole point of precision strikes, surgical removal of threats without collateral damage.
I failed at the most fundamental level. Marcus stepped closer, his expression softening with understanding. You didn't fail. The system failed you. The intelligence was wrong, Sarah.
Not just incomplete or outdated, deliberately falsified by a double agent who had been feeding bad information to coalition forces for months. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd spent 3 years believing that she'd somehow missed something, that her analysis of the target had been flawed, that her execution had been imperfect. The possibility that the intelligence itself had been compromised had never occurred to her because no one had ever told her about it. "That's impossible," she whispered. "If there had been a double agent, if the intelligence was compromised, that would have been part of the investigation."
"I would have been told."
"You would have been told if the investigation had been completed properly," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much military politics. "But, 3 days after your bombing run, Senator Richardson's nephew was killed in a separate incident in the same province. Richardson sits on the Armed Services Committee and has presidential aspirations. He needed someone to blame for the deteriorating situation, and you were perfect, a single pilot whose actions could be isolated and criticized without exposing the larger intelligence failures." Sarah felt the world spinning around her. Senator Richardson had been one of her most vocal critics during the congressional hearings, painting her as a reckless pilot who had acted without proper authorization. His questions had been sharp and accusatory, designed to make her look incompetent and trigger-happy in front of the cameras. Richardson buried the investigation into the double agent, Marcus continued. The CIA was close to exposing the entire network, but Richardson's political pressure forced them to focus on finding individual scapegoats instead of addressing the systemic problems. Your case was expedited through the military justice system before the intelligence community could complete their analysis.
"How do you know all this?"
Sarah asked, her voice hollow. Marcus was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal.
"Because I wasn't just on the team you saved that day. I was the intelligence liaison for the operation.
Part of my job was to verify target information and coordinate with various intelligence agencies. After your bombing run, I was tasked with conducting the battlefield damage assessment." Sarah stared at him, her mind racing to put together pieces of information that she'd never had access to.
"You were there? At the compound?"
"I was there," Marcus confirmed. "I was the one who went through the debris, who cataloged what we found, who interviewed the local sources about the building's use. I was the one who discovered that the structure had been converted from an ammunition depot to a civilian shelter only 6 hours before your strike, information that was never passed along to your mission planners." The weight of this revelation was staggering. For 3 years, Sarah had carried the burden of believing that she'd somehow failed to properly identify her target, that her pre-flight intelligence review had been inadequate, that her decision-making under pressure had been flawed. Learning that the information she'd based her decisions on had been deliberately falsified changed everything. 6 hours, she repeated numbly. The families had only been there for 6 hours. 6 hours, and they'd been moved there by the very people who were feeding intelligence to our enemy, Marcus said. "It was a setup, Sarah. The double agent wanted civilian casualties to undermine public support for coalition operations. Your precision and skill actually minimized the damage. A less experienced pilot would have leveled the entire block." Sarah felt her legs giving out and slumped against her car, sliding down until she was sitting on the asphalt. The parking lot was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic and the muffled music from the bar. Marcus crouched down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Why didn't someone tell me 3 years ago?" "Because 3 years ago, I was a staff sergeant who'd just been through a traumatic extraction and was dealing with my own survivor's guilt," Marcus said. "When I tried to raise questions about the intelligence, I was told to focus on my recovery and let the investigators do their jobs. By the time I realized that the investigation was being steered toward a predetermined conclusion, you'd already been processed out of the military and had disappeared." "You looked for me?" "I've been looking for you for 2 years," Marcus admitted. Ever since I made lieutenant commander and gained access to the classified files from that operation. When I saw what had really happened, when I understood how you'd been sacrificed to protect Richardson's political career and cover up the intelligence failures, I knew I had to find you." Sarah looked up at him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief.
"You made lieutenant commander? I thought you said you were enlisted."
Marcus smiled ruefully.
"I was enlisted then. Battlefield commission 6 months later, followed by officer candidate school.
The Navy needed experienced special operations officers, and I'd already proven myself in combat. Your actions that day were part of the recommendation letter my commanding officer wrote for my commission."
The irony was almost overwhelming.
Sarah's career had been destroyed by the fallout from that mission, while Marcus had been promoted partly based on his performance during the same operation. It was a stark reminder of how arbitrary military justice could be when politics got involved. "I still don't understand why you've been looking for me," Sarah said. "Even if everything you're telling me is true, it doesn't change what happened. Those people are still dead, and I'm still the one who killed them." Marcus sat down on the asphalt beside her, his expensive clothes be damned. "You're right that they're still dead. But you're wrong about who killed them. The person who killed those civilians was the double agent who deliberately moved them into a military target to create propaganda. You were just the weapon he used, and weapons don't bear moral responsibility for how they're employed by others." Sarah shook her head, tears finally starting to fall. "That's easy to say, but I was the one who pulled the trigger. I was the one who chose that target, who executed that bombing run. I can tell myself that I was following orders and using the best information available, but at the end of the day, my actions caused those deaths." "Your actions also saved countless other lives," Marcus said firmly. "The intelligence network that the double agent was part of was responsible for at least 24 successful attacks on coalition forces over the previous year. The information we recovered from that compound allowed us to roll up the entire network within 6 months. The number of lives saved because of your mission runs into the hundreds, possibly thousands."
"How can you quantify something like that?" Sarah asked. "How do you weigh 18 innocent lives against hundreds of hypothetical ones?"
"You don't," Marcus said quietly. "That's not how it works. You don't get to do a mathematical calculation and decide whether your actions were justified. But you also don't get to ignore the broader context and carry guilt that isn't yours to carry." They sat in silence for several minutes, watching cars move through the parking lot as the bar began to empty for the night. Sarah felt emotionally drained, as if years of carefully constructed defenses had been dismantled in the space of an hour. She'd built her entire post-military life around the assumption that she was guilty of an unforgivable mistake, and now Marcus was telling her that everything she thought she knew about that day was wrong.
"What happened to the double agent?" she asked finally.
"CIA neutralized him about 18 months ago," Marcus said.
"Took them that long to build a case that would hold up in international court."
He was feeding information to 3 different terrorist organizations and had been responsible for at least 47 coalition deaths over a 2-year period.
"And Richardson?"
Marcus's expression darkened.
"Still in the Senate. Still positioning himself for a presidential run. Still using veterans like you as political footballs whenever it's convenient for his narrative."
The bitterness in Marcus's voice made it clear that this wasn't just professional knowledge for him.
"You've had dealings with him?"
"He killed a medal recommendation for my team after that operation," Marcus said. "Decided that any public recognition of our heroism that day might draw attention to the intelligence failures that made the mission necessary. 6 men who risked their lives for their country were denied recognition they'd earned because it was politically inconvenient."
Sarah felt a surge of anger on behalf of Marcus and his team.
She'd been so focused on her own guilt and shame that she'd never considered how the political fallout from that day might have affected the people she'd saved.
"I'm sorry.
You and your team deserved better." "We all deserved better," Marcus said. "But that's the reality of modern warfare. Sometimes politics matter more than performance, and good people get sacrificed to protect bad systems."
"So what now?" Sarah asked.
"You found me, you've told me the truth about what happened.
What exactly are you hoping to accomplish?
Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the stars that were barely visible through the light pollution.
Honestly? I'm not entirely sure.
For 2 years, finding you and telling you the truth was the goal. I guess I thought that if you knew what really happened, it might help somehow.
Help with what?
Help you stop punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault, Marcus said simply. Help you understand that walking away from flying was a tragedy, not just for you but for everyone who might have benefited from your skills and experience. Help you see that Viper 1 was a call sign you earned through heroism, not one you lost through failure. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing makeup that she rarely wore anymore. I can't just go back to flying, Marcus.
Even if everything you're telling me is true, I'm not the same person I was 3 years ago.
I've been out of the cockpit too long, my certifications have lapsed, and, frankly, I'm not sure I trust myself to make life or death decisions anymore.
I'm not suggesting you go back to active duty, Marcus said. But there are other options. Test pilot programs, civilian aviation, flight instruction, aerospace consulting.
Your experience and expertise are valuable in a lot of contexts.
You make it sound so simple.
It's not simple at all, Marcus admitted.
But it's possible. The question is whether you're willing to try.
Sarah looked at her hands, noting the calluses that had faded since she'd stopped working on aircraft maintenance as a hobby.
I don't know if I'm ready for that conversation yet. This is a lot to process. Marcus nodded and reached into his wallet, pulling out a business card. This has my contact information, cell phone, email, office number.
I'm stationed at Coronado right now, but I travel a lot for training and operations. If you want to talk more about any of this, or if you just need someone who understands what you've been through, call me. Sarah took the card, noting that it identified Marcus as LT.
Commander Marcus Chen, Naval Special Warfare Development Group.
DevGru, the most elite SEAL unit in the Navy. Marcus hadn't just been promoted, he'd been selected for the absolute top tier of special operations.
DevGru, she asked. That's impressive.
Marcus shrugged as if it was no big deal, but Sarah could see the pride in his eyes. Your actions that day were part of the recommendation package that got me selected. The review board was impressed by how I'd handled the coordination between ground forces and air support under extreme pressure. So my career was destroyed while yours flourished, all because of the same mission, Sarah said, but without bitterness.
It was just an observation about the arbitrary nature of military politics.
That's exactly why I had to find you, Marcus said intensely.
The injustice of it has been eating at me for years.
You deserved commendations and recognition, not congressional hearings and forced retirement. I couldn't do anything to change what happened to you, but I could at least make sure you knew the truth. Sarah stood up slowly, her joints stiff from sitting on the cold asphalt. Marcus rose beside her, and, for a moment they stood facing each other in the empty parking lot, two veterans connected by a single day that had changed both of their lives in dramatically different ways.
Thank you, Sarah said quietly.
For looking for me, for telling me the truth, for caring enough to spend 2 years trying to find someone you barely knew.
I knew you well enough, Marcus said.
I knew you were the kind of pilot who would risk her own life to save others. I knew you were the kind of person who would carry guilt that wasn't hers to carry rather than let someone else bear responsibility for a mistake. And I knew that if our positions had been reversed, you would have moved heaven and earth to set the record straight.
Sarah felt fresh tears threatening and fought them back. I'm not sure that's true. I am, Marcus said with absolute certainty.
That's who Viper 1 was, and it's who Sarah Mitchell still is, underneath all the guilt and self-doubt. Sarah unlocked her car and opened the driver's side door, then paused.
Marcus?
That night, when your team was pinned down in the compound, were you really about to be overrun, or are you exaggerating for effect? Marcus met her eyes directly. We had maybe 3 minutes left before they would have breached our final defensive position. Rodriguez was unconscious from blood loss, and we were down to our last magazines of ammunition. If you hadn't shown up when you did, none of us would have made it to the extraction point. The simple honesty of his words hit Sarah harder than any dramatic speech could have. For 3 years, she'd focused on the people who had died because of her actions, but she'd never really considered the people who had lived. 6 men with families, careers, and futures ahead of them had gone home because of her skill and courage under pressure. "Get some sleep," Marcus said as Sarah got into her car. "And think about what I said. The world needs good pilots, and, whether you believe it or not, you're one of the best who ever lived." Sarah drove home through empty streets, her mind spinning with everything Marcus had told her. Her apartment, which had felt like a refuge when she'd moved in 3 years ago, now felt like a prison cell where she'd been serving a sentence for a crime she hadn't committed. She sat in her living room until dawn, staring at Marcus's business card and thinking about call signs, about the weight of command, about the difference between guilt and responsibility. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to remember what it had felt like to be Viper 1, the confidence, the precision, the absolute trust that her squadron mates had placed in her abilities. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe it was time to stop punishing herself for a tragedy that had been engineered by someone else. Maybe it was time to consider the possibility that Viper 1 could fly again. Sarah didn't call Marcus for 3 weeks. Instead, she spent those weeks in a strange state of emotional limbo, going through the motions of her civilian life while her mind processed everything he'd told her. She worked her shifts at the aerospace consulting firm where she'd been employed for the past 18 months, reviewing technical specifications and writing reports that used her engineering.